Hello everyone, and welcome back to the International Business Management course. Today we will cover the third lecture of the course. We will go over the 4 risks of international business management as we did in the last lecture. Today we will take in depth the cultural environment. Last time, if you guys remember, we covered the 4 risks: the cultural risk, the cross-cultural risk, the commercial risk, the financial or the country risk, and the political and legal risk. Today's lecture we will focus on the cultural risk and how when we think of internationalization we have to take in mind and we have to thoroughly study the cultural environment of the foreign market which we are trying to study. So what are the cultural components, or what are the cultural elements that we have to study? We will see as following. The cultural environment involves understanding the culture and the cross-cultural risk, learning the dimension of culture, describing the role of language and religion in culture, describing the culture's effect in international businesses, learning the models and the explanation of culture from different perspectives, and finally, in today's lecture, we will understand the managerial implications of culture and how I, as an international business management, I have to take all of these elements or all of these components into consideration so I do not fall under the cross-cultural risk. So let's begin. Let's start with the key concepts of culture. In order to gather information about the foreign culture or the foreign market that we are trying to enter, we have to first identify or understand the concept of culture. Very simply speaking, culture is the different values and beliefs and customs and arts and all of these elements are the main components that make up a culture and differentiate one culture from another. What cross-cultural risk means is it's the risk that arises from the differences within cultures. No culture, there is no unified culture. Every culture has its own customs, it has its own beliefs, it has its own ways. So therefore, not realizing this and not adapting to this, you can fall under the cross-cultural risk. Therefore, when we are talking about cultures, another key concept we have to understand is the difference between socialization and acculturation. And these are the main terminologies that you have to understand when you are studying the foreign markets and studying or thinking of entering a foreign or an international market. The concept of socialization is getting to know different cultures. It's the concept of understanding the differences from your home culture or your own culture in accordance to other cultures or foreign cultures and so on. So as you see here, it's described that socialization is the process of learning the rules and the behavioral patterns appropriate to one's society. Then, after you learn the differences from your culture to a foreign culture, you start doing something called acculturation. Now, from the business sense, acculturation is the process of actually adjusting or adapting your culture to meet or to out of respect to the foreign culture or of the market that you are trying to enter. So therefore, as you can see, acculturation is the process of adjusting and adapting to a culture other than your own, and it's commonly experienced by workers and so on. Okay, so again, what is culture? As I said in the beginning, culture is not unified. It differs from nation to nation, and we even have sometimes something called subcultures. So we could be living in one country, but we have different subcultures and different subnations and so on. So understanding culture, you have to understand that there is no right or wrong. There is nothing called an appropriate or a correct culture and a wrong culture. It differs and it is relevant. So therefore, there is no culture obsolete. There is different nationalities. They just simply perceive matters or they perceive the world in different ways. So therefore, it's not about individual behavior. It is about groups. It is a collective phenomena. So it's not an individualistic phenomena. And it is a collective phenomena of shared values and meanings. Therefore, this is what makes up a culture. Also, it's another misunderstanding is that people think that culture is inherited, and this is actually not true. Culture is not inherited. It's derived from the social environment which we are surrounded by. So in other words, or to simplify, we are not born with shared sets of values and beliefs as most people think. We acquire them as we grow up. So therefore, culture, does it differ? Yes, it does. Can it change based on the century or based on the years that we are living in? Yes, because dimensions change, as we know. So therefore, what are the main essential elements which we will cover today that make up a culture? Is the cross-cultural risk. As we said before, it's the risk that arises from not understanding or not knowing the differences in cultures. The different dimensions of cultures we will take in detail, such as the values, the attitudes, and so on. The different languages, the religion, the models and explanations of cultures which were derived from different theories and different histories of cultures, and the managerial implications that we have to take into consideration, since we are talking about internationalizing and managing international businesses. So what are the managerial implications which we have to take into consideration? Okay, so let's begin with the first part. What are the key dimensions of cultures? As we said when we were defining culture, culture is known as the different values, the different attitudes, and the different preferences that we have. This is what makes up a culture. So what are values? It represents the person's judgment. It represents what you or what an individual believes in. What do I believe is good and what do I believe is bad? These actually differ from culture to culture, and people usually think that the values are fixed or values are universal. While some elements of value could be universal, but others do vary from culture to culture. So what is accepted in terms of a certain judgment or what is considered okay in my culture might be considered as demeaning or disrespectful in another culture. So therefore, one of the dimensions of culture is the different values. Also, the attitudes and preferences. There is certain ways of handling certain situations or how I react to certain situations. These are also backed up by my culture. So attitudes and preferences are developed based on your values and what you believe in. Therefore, they definitely impact your opinion, and they impact the way you handle your opinion. So here they're giving you an example of values common to the Japanese or the North American and Northern European nations include hard work, punctuality, and wealth acquisition. So usually these nations have that same value. Everyone is working for that same value. People cherish hard work. People are very strict when it comes to timing, and all of these components we will actually take in details, and all of these do make up or differentiate one culture from another, and we will see how. Moving on, other components or other dimensions that make up or differentiate one culture to another is the manners and the customs and the perception of space. And I think if you travel, you might have noticed these components where when we are talking about manners and we are talking about customs, it refers to the way we behave in certain situations, how we conduct ours or how do we carry ourselves in public. And of course, since we are talking about internationalizing of businesses, so how does this impact my business transactions? So starting from the way you greet your partners in a work meeting to your negotiation patterns, all of these differ from culture to culture. Also, perception of space, it also reflects each or an individual's culture. People perceive space differently. So what do I mean by this? Different cultures perceive that they should have their own personal space, while in other cultures they are open to having a conversation while they are sitting very close to one another, or they don't really take into consideration the concept of personal space and so on. So when I'm dealing with other people from different cultures in a business meeting or in a business negotiation or whatever, I have to definitely take this into consideration, because it could come off as being disrespectful or crossing or stepping certain boundaries. So the perception of space, as we know in Arab nations, we are more open to the concept of we're not really restricted to personal space as in Western countries, where they strongly believe in the concept of personal space, and that in order to have a conversation with one another, there should be a certain boundary or a certain physical space between you and the other individual. So in other words, not to be talking to someone and being very close to them, or very close to them. This is definitely not acceptable in many countries, and certain cultures think this as a way of disrespect or just unacceptable behavior. Other components of culture, as we said earlier, is the perception of time. And I think we are all familiar that different nations or different cultures perceive time differently. And we see this from the way they make their appointments to their meeting timings and so on. So timing, it dictates the expectation about planning, scheduling, the profit streams, and what constitutes tardiness in arriving for work and meetings. So, or tardiness in arriving to work and meetings. So how punctual are we? And usually time is differentiated or classified into two main dimensions. We either have monochronic timing and we have polychronic timing. In other words, monochronic cultures are usually the cultures that are very strict when it comes to timing. They, as we see in Western movies and in Western sayings, that they always follow the concept of timing is money. They are very strict with their timing. So if you're wasting their time, this is basically as if you are wasting profit opportunities and so on. While in polychronic cultures, the way they perceive time is that they are very flexible when it comes to timing, and many Arab nations are actually considered as polychronic cultures when it comes to time, is that they think that individuals should take their time, and they should take their time when it comes to making decisions and so on. Even with business meetings, their timing is not very rigid and so on. So again, monochronic are rigid orientations to time in which the individual is focused on schedules and punctuality, while polychronic nations or polychronic cultures are more flexible and non-linear orientation to time in which the individual takes a long-term perspective to see things. So there's a kind of flexibility, and punctuality is not that big of a deal in comparison to the monochronic cultures. Okay, so moving on, when we are talking about cultures, we also have to take into consideration the symbolic and the material components or the material elements that make up different cultures. How can certain elements make up a culture in terms of symbols? I think we can all relate that a symbol such as a letter or a figure or a color can be used or are identified or associated with different cultures. Or materials such as artifacts and objects and so on. So when we are talking about Egypt, the first thing that you could symbolize, or one of the main symbols of Egypt, is the great Egyptian pyramids. So these are actual monuments or artifacts that Egypt is very well known for. Also, when we are talking about France or when we are talking about Paris, the first thing that we think of is the Eiffel Tower and so on. So these are monuments or artifacts that we symbolize or symbolize different cultures. Also, what are the different societies? When we are talking about cultures, we have to understand that societies are a huge part of cultures. Now, what are the societies? The different society structures are known as the individuals, the family, the reference groups or the work groups, the social interactions or the people that we socialize with, and the social mobility. All of these elements make up society, and we will see how. Also, another key dimension when we are talking about cultural differences and to avoid cross-cultural risk is definitely languages. Languages are made up of non-verbal cues and verbal cues. So a language is definitely considered as the mirror of expressions of cultures. It's the most essential way of communication. So therefore, when I'm thinking of internationalizing my business, I definitely have to take into consideration and study and understand the cultural elements in terms of language. Therefore, usually linguistics is also associated, or one of the components that we have to understand when we are thinking of entering foreign markets. And linguistics is the proficiency in, which is a great asset in international business. So if I'm known to be linguistically strong, or I know different languages, and then this means I can easily communicate within the foreign market, and this makes many transactions and the business transition a lot easier if I can actually understand and communicate with the foreign markets. And this is actually a very interesting piece of information. Usually when we talk about languages and we talk about international business, people would assume that the most common language in the world is English, and this is actually statistically has been proven to be a wrong piece of information. When we are talking about universal languages or languages in the world, the primary language is actually Chinese. I know that most of you would have thought that it would be English, as you would think that this is the most spoken language, but it has actually been statistically proven that it is Chinese. And comes second Spanish, and then third is actually English, which is the third primary language all over the world. And as you can see, Arabic comes in fifth. And when I'm thinking of internationalizing, this could be a helpful use of information, because I have to understand the different languages that I have to be fluent in, or I have to study and understand in order to be able to communicate with the people that I will do business with. Another component of culture is understanding, and also this is part of the language, is understanding the idioms. What is meant by idioms? Idioms are an expression which has symbolic meanings. It means that it differs from the literal saying. So again, it's an expression whose symbolic meaning differs from its literal meaning. You can't understand it simply by knowing what the individual words mean. So it's an indirect way, or it's an indirect message given through a certain statement. And some examples are, for example, in Austria, they directly say the tall poppy gets cut down. Now, you would not really understand what this means, because this is an idiom. It represents, or it symbolizes a different element or something that they are trying to get across, which here is the the importance of not being showy, or known as a show off, or trying to be pretentious of what you have, and so on. So it's a statement, but its meaning differs from its literal wording. Also in Thailand, they say one of their known idioms is, if you follow older people, dogs won't bite you. And this is what they're trying to say, is that following the elders, or listening to your elders, they have wisdom. So therefore, you will not be falling into any risks, because these people have wisdom and they know what they're talking about, and so on. While in Japan, another idiom that they are known for is, the nail that sticks out gets hammered down. In other words, they are trying to portray or to try to stress on group conformity or group harmony, and this is what Asian or Japanese culture is known for, that they are very group oriented. Okay. Now, when we are talking about non-verbal communication, it's the components of elements, or the elements such as the, for example, your non-verbal hand movement, your eye, the ways you are dealing with your eye movements, the way you portray or carry yourself, the way of talking. So, for example, we have, as Arabs or as Egyptian culture, we are very well known for speaking with our hands. And for us, this is normal. No one takes it as a sign of disrespect and so on. But in many cultures and in Western cultures, they think that they take it as a sign of aggressiveness, and it's something that is considered as a sign of disrespect. So elements, or these non-behavior communications, are components that we have to definitely be very careful with. Certain sounds that could be accepted in one culture and in other cultures be taken as a disrespectful movement, or the way your head movement, your posture, your stance, and so on. All of these are considered non-verbal communication cues that could be mistaken or taken as offensive if I did not study the other or the foreign cultures, non-communication cues of what is acceptable and not acceptable, and so on. And this is something that I definitely have to take into consideration, because when I'm dealing with business transactions, I don't want to come off as disrespectful or rude. Okay, so another main component of culture is definitely religion. And actually, religion is it plays a major role when it comes to culture, because our religion, or the main religions that are available in one culture, it definitely comes off, or it is portrayed in the way we behave. We usually behave according to the way or what we believe in, and what we are convinced with, and so on. And this goes back to our religion. So therefore, a system of religion is a system of common beliefs or attitudes regarding a being or an individual, or system of thoughts that people consider as sacred or divine, or it's the absolute truth. Also, it's associated with the morals and values and traditions and rituals that are applied in one culture in comparison to another. So therefore, religion definitely influences culture, and therefore businesses and consumer behavior is highly influenced through such elements such as religion. Starting from what products to purchase, or what products to produce, and how to advertise for them or promote these products. All of these business transactions, or all of these business elements, we definitely have to, while we are carrying them out, we have to take into consideration the different religious elements. So again, it doesn't come off as disrespecting a certain religion, and we will see certain examples. Since we are an Arab nation, we will take the role of religion in Islamic societies, and since we are known as an Islamic society, we will understand how Islam, for example, as a religion could impact certain business transactions. So here they're telling you that Islam is the basis for government. So therefore, even our laws and regulations are according to the Islamic laws. And we will go into details about this part when we take the political and legal risk, or the political and legal environment in details. As Muslims view God's will as the source of all outcomes, they are relatively fatalistic and reactive. Or in other words, Islamic's holy book, which is the Quran, prohibits drinking alcohol, gambling, and immodest exposure. And these are elements that have to be taken into consideration, as I was just saying, in business transactions or in marketing of products and services and so on. Some major examples that I think we can relate to is Nokia, what they did when they launched a new mobile phone. They embedded a certain feature that shows the direction, or the Muslims, the direction towards Mecca, in order for them to be able to properly conduct their prayer. And also Heineken, which is a well-known beer producer, or a beer alcoholic drink company, when they entered an Islamic country, they came out with a new product, which is a non-alcoholic beverage, since alcohol is prohibited in Islam. So out of respect for this, they came out with a non-alcoholic malt drink, which is known as Fairuz, and so on. And again, this is how businesses adapt to certain cultures in terms of their religion, in order to respect this culture's religion, and so on. So in business, what does culture affect exactly? We spoke about the cultural dimensions in details. What are the different elements or the different components that differentiate one culture from another? Now, from a business perspective, how can these impact the way I handle my business, or in other words, the way I manage my business? And it's important to understand these dimensions, because in business, culture affects the way we can manage our employees, as employees could come from different cultural backgrounds. So it's definitely important to understand these differences and know how to deal with your employees. Also, it highly impacts the communication and the dealing with distributors and other business partners, as I stated earlier. The negotiation and the structuring of the business ventures, so the negotiation transactions, the development of products and services, as we were just mentioning, or we were just giving the examples of Heineken and Nokia, and how they changed their products, or they came up with new products to adjust to the culture that they are conducting business in. And as I was telling you earlier, the preparation of advertising and marketing activities, the preparing for international trade affairs as well, and the interacting with current and potential customers. I don't want to be targeting certain certain customers, and then do something that might offend them, and so on, just because I did not take the time to understand their culture and the different dimensions of their culture. Okay, so when we are talking about culture, we need to understand how culture is defined from different perspectives, or we could say that culture is classified in different ways. So we can either classify culture in terms of high context and low context cultures, and as you see here, these are the main characteristics or the main points that differentiate between the different types of cultures or the different contexts of culture, while low context cultures are known to rely on explicit explanation with emphasis on spoken words. So they are very strict with their wordings, and they're very straightforward. And also, low context cultures are known as cultures that emphasize clear and efficient logical delivery of verbal messages, and they are known to be very contract oriented. Everything has to be legally classified and legally stated, and so on, and authorized. Also, communication is very direct, as I said earlier, and agreements are conducted on legal and specific contracts. While in comparison to high context cultures, usually in high context cultures, they emphasize more on nonverbal or indirect languages. Therefore, you will notice that usually business transactions take much longer timing. Communication aims to promote a kind of harmonizing relationships and smooth relationships. They are very relationship oriented. And such cultures, which are known as high context cultures, usually prefer a polite, face-to-face saying style that emphasizes the mutual sense of care and respect for others, and care is taken not to embarrass or offend the opponent or the other party. So in low context and high context cultures, as a business trying to enter a new market, I have to understand which type of culture I am dealing with, whether it is low context or high context, so I can be able to easily communicate with them, and again, not to fall into any type of risk in the way they deal or the way they handle certain business transactions. Okay, so moving on to another classification of culture is the Hofstede's typology of national cultures. When we are starting or when we are trying to differentiate between different cultures, it is done in different, within different characteristics or different differentiation dimensions, such as we know that some cultures are considered as individual cultures, while others are known as collectivism cultures. So what is the difference? I think from the terminologies we can guess what they mean. When we are talking about individualistic societies, we are related to, or we are talking about societies that they emphasize on an individual self-interest. They are very competitive with their resources, and it's also sometimes they refer to themselves as a one-man show. So here I'm just trying to move on, or I'm trying to enhance my career path, I'm trying to reach my personal goals and so on, and I'm overlooking the bigger picture or the bird's eye view, and these are the individualistic societies. And a common country that's known to be an individualistic society is the USA. Now, another, the opposite is collectivism or collective societies, which are known to do everything in terms of groups. They are very team-oriented, and therefore they are always trying to focus on the relationship management and how to enhance and promote relationships. And usually collectivism societies are such as are known to be the Chinese or the Japanese, and mainly the Asian societies and countries that believe in harmony and team building and team work and so on. When we are classifying culture, we also can classify them in terms of power. Who has the power in societies? We have something called the high power distance and the lower power distance. So in other words, who makes the main strategic decisions? Who is in charge? And in high power distance is the societies that exhibit big gaps between the weak and the powerful. So you will notice that the top management are very strict, and they barely communicate with the lower level employees and so on. So they're very strict with their hierarchy chart and the differences, and the gap between the different levels of management or the different hierarchy chart in the organization is definitely very visible. Now, in lower power distance cultures, these are the societies that have small gaps between the weak and the powerful. So you will notice that the powerful or the top management here communicates with their lower level employees. They can either have them interact in certain decision making or in planning phases and so on. Another part of Hofstede's typology is the uncertainty avoidance and the high uncertainty. So what's meant by high uncertainty or low uncertainty is that different cultures perceive risk differently. So cultures that are high, that promote or that adapt a high uncertainty, or known as high uncertainty cultures, these are the societies that are always trying to avoid taking risks. They are very prone, or they don't like to take risks or to make certain business transactions that they know that are not, that might be riskier, or that might come with a baggage that could impact or harm their business and so on. So they try to avoid risk as much as possible. And low uncertainty are the organizations that are relatively prone to risks. They like taking risks. They believe that the higher the risk, the more the return or the more the profit will be. And these are cultures such as Ireland, Jamaica, and US. So people are comfortable with making changes. They're okay with entering new markets or doing changing their jobs and so on. They're comfortable with making outside of the box decisions and so on. Another element that also is under Hofstede's typology is differentiating cultures in terms of masculinity versus femininity. So we have masculine cultures and we have feminine cultures. What's meant by this is that certain cultures are known to be masculine cultures, where men are the ones who are mainly in charge of certain business elements, or not just business, even daily to daily transactions and life matters. They are known to have to be masculine based or masculine oriented. So masculine cultures value competitiveness, ambition, assertive and tough ways of conducting business transactions, while feminine cultures emphasize nurturing roles and interdependence among people and caring for the less fortunate and so on. And you will notice this within the way these different cultures handle social responsibility and deal with social responsibility. Lastly, when we are talking about Hofstede's typology, is the long-term versus short-term orientations. What's meant by this is that nations who are, or cultures that are known to have a long-term orientation, they definitely emphasize looking at things on a long base view in terms of planning and living and focusing on years and dedication, and this impacts the way they set their mission and their vision and their overall business plan. While short-term businesses or short-term nations or orientations, here they typically focus on the short run. So I want to make a business meeting, for example, that will increase my current market share. So they don't really take the perspective of the visionary perspective, and nations that are known to have short-term orientations are such as the US and other Western countries. Also, we have the indulgence versus restraint. What is meant by this part is that members of indulgent societies allow relatively free gratification of their basic and their neutral human desires. So how do I control my behavior? How do I control my impressions and so on? So in indulgent societies, here the human desires are related to having fun and generally enjoying life, and this reflects the way I behave. While restrained societies are more conservative and they gratify or respect certain strict norms and so on. And these components can actually highly impact the way we market for a certain product or the way we advertise and the type of commercials which we could use and so on. Now, when we are talking about deal versus relationship orientations, when we were talking about high context and low context culture, we kind of went over this part indirectly, where when we are talking about orientations in terms of deal versus relationship, a deal-oriented culture is mainly where managers just focus on accomplishing or fulfilling the task on hand. They are very deal-oriented. They just want to get the job done. While in other nations, as we said before, like the Japanese or the Asian cultures, they are very known to have to be relationship-oriented. While throughout their business transactions, they want to maintain good and long-term relationships with their business partners and etc. So What are the different managerial orientations? Now that we understand how culture has so many dimensions that we have to study and we have to take into consideration when we are thinking of engaging in international business, now how can managers orient, or how can they perceive culture differently? And mainly we have three main managerial orientations. First, we have ethnocentric orientation, we have polycentric orientation, and geocentric orientation. And what's meant by the managerial orientations is how managers perceive different cultures. As we understood earlier, that we study these cultures in order to avoid cross-cultural risk. So we want, within our business transactions, we want to respect this difference in cultures. So how can managers take this into consideration? Now, if I'm a manager or I'm a management that is following an ethnocentric orientation, this means that I will be using my own culture as a standard for judging other cultures. In other words, I have a belief that whatever is acceptable and appropriate in my culture, it will also be accepted in other nations or other cultures as well. And this is actually very inconvenient, because here I am overlooking the differences within cultures. So all of the information I gather to avoid the cross-cultural risk, if I'm not respecting these differences and I'm following an ethnocentric orientation, this can definitely ruin and jeopardize my ability to internationalize, because it will be taken as it could be taken as offensive in within different nations. While the opposite is polycentric. Here, in a polycentric orientation means that I, as a management, I believe in and respect the differences between culture in comparison to another culture, or nation to nation. And this is why I would be applying a polycentric orientation, which means that I adapt my business transactions and my business methods and ways and so on in respect to the differences in the foreign culture. While geocentric orientation, it means that I have an orientation in terms of a global mindset. Here, I believe that, or as a manager, I am able to understand a business or market without regard to national boundaries. Managers should strive here for a geocentric orientation, because this means that you have reached a global level. Your business has achieved the last level of business accomplishments, where you have reached globalization and you know very well how to transition and to penetrate markets from all over the world. So, as we have noticed, culture is linked with particular groups based on various factors, including geography, so the physical geographic location, or that makes where the country is or the nation is, and so on. The ethnicity, so for example, people of African or Indian or Latino heritage, they tend to perceive the world differently. Gender, age, language, and occupation are all components that are linked with different cultures. So, again, the managerial guidelines, in order to avoid cross-cultural risk and to transition or to take into consideration the cross-cultural components to be successful, is to acquire factual and interpretive knowledge about the other culture, try to speak their language. As we said in the beginning, the concept of socialization and acculturation is very important. Avoid cultural bias, so try not to always use your own culture as a benchmark, or that your culture is the best in comparison to others. You have to definitely not have any bias towards different cultures, and you have to develop cross-cultural skills. In other words, know how to accept different perspectives, know how to have interpersonal skills or communication skills, and have the ability to adapt to the different markets that you are trying to enter. Okay, so what are the personality traits for cross-cultural proficiency, or how can we succeed in understanding these different cultures and try to avoid falling into the cultural risk is having tolerance for ambiguity. So I have to respect that people are different, cultures are different. I have to have the ability to tolerate the uncertainty and lack of clarity in the thinking and actions of others, because again, we cannot all have the same mindset and so on. Also, perceptiveness in terms of the ability to closely observe and comprehend subtle information in the speech and behavior of others, and we can do this. A person who has a strong ability to understand and to evaluate the behavioral and non-behavioral cues of the individual in front of them. This is very strategically important when dealing with people from different cultural backgrounds. Also, valuing personal relationships. You should be strategically smart in terms of to have the ability to appreciate personal relationships, which are often more important than achieving one-time goals or winning arguments. So building strong relationships is definitely a trait that will enhance your ability to transition from or enter foreign markets. Also, to be able to be flexible and have the adaptability technique to adapt my ways and to adapt my mindset to the foreign market in order to be respectful of their culture and their beliefs and their values and so on. So this is the end of lecture 3. I hope that the cultural dimension or the cultural environment was easily understood and defined, and as an international business management, or when we are talking about managing international business and entering foreign markets, it's very important to understand these dimensions. It might seem like a lot of work, but it definitely is beneficial at the end, because if you do all of this and you take all of these dimensions into consideration, you will definitely avoid falling into cross-cultural risk, which can jeopardize and highly harm your business. Thank you, and I will see you guys in the next video.